Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. My name is Maura McGinty-Klaas, and I'd like to welcome you from the Natural Areas Association. And thank you for joining us for our webinar series. The purpose of NAA webinars is not just to convey information, but to engage natural areas professionals on topics of interest that highlight emerging science and methodologies and best practices. So I just want to tell you a little bit about the Natural Areas Association. We're a national nonprofit organization. We serve practitioners who manage ecologically significant landscapes to protect biodiversity. We contend that protecting natural areas in perpetuity requires quality science to inform practices and access to reliable resources. So NAA is that resource. We provide science-based content for natural areas practitioners, researchers who are seeking applied science, practical solutions, and just an opportunity for knowledge transfer in the areas of natural areas management. If you're watching today's webinar as a registered person, you will receive access to a recording. If you are a member of NAA, you do receive access not just to all of our webinars at no charge, but you also have access to our archive. If you would like to join NAA, we will take off the amount that you paid to participate in this webinar and credit you for that, and you can have a membership. And then you can see all of our webinars. I just want to let everyone know that one of the things NAA does every year is that we are proud to celebrate the exceptional contributions of people like yourselves who are protecting biodiversity throughout the country. And many of you are familiar with our awards, the George Fell Lifetime Achievement Award, the Carr Becker Stewardship Award, but we are also launching a third award this year. The first time in 2022 is the Rising Leader Award, which is for people within the first 10 years of their career. So if there is someone that you know or you've worked with who you think deserves recognition, please take a moment and fill out the nomination. Nominations are open until June 10th. And we have a committee that will be reviewing all of those. And it's such an impressive thing. And it's a time where we can really celebrate. So a lot of times what is a very thankless, it feels very thankless, even though it's very valuable work. I want to just remind people that the Natural Areas Conference in 2022 will be in person. It's being held September 6th through 9, 2022 in Duluth, Minnesota. This will be our 49th convening. We have over 100 concurrent sessions, hands-on, half-day workshops, field workshops, and we're just really excited about all the opportunities. So registration will be officially announced as open tomorrow, but the website is ready and ready to go. Please feel free to go to our website, naturalareas.org, and register for the conference. We're also hosting on Tuesday, June 28th, a virtual symposium, Shared Stewardship Collaborating to Effectively Co-Manage the Chippewa National Forest. It's in cooperation with the U.S. Forest Service and the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe. And it's from 11 to 3 p.m. And this is a unique model of collaboration between the Forest Service and the tribe to effectively co-manage this forest. So we are excited to be able to share this with you, and we hope that you'll consider registering. Another in-person opportunity is July 19th to the 21st, the Stewardship in Action Field Workshop, Fragmented Prairies and Grasslands, Reconnecting Habitats Through Collaborative Partnerships. This will be held in Southwest Minnesota, and it will focus on the Minnesota Conservation Prairie Plan, which is a public and private collaboration to save the prairies in that area. And then in June, we have a webinar, Fire Ecology in the Upper Midwest. And July 12th, Join the Crowd, Standardized Monitoring Protocols for Prairie and Savanna. And this just added, Native Seed Partnerships, collaborations to increase regional seed availability. And this is being offered by the Institute for Applied Ecology and is going to highlight some of their collaborative partnerships that could be a model for other parts of the country. And now let's get started with our webinar for today, and let me introduce our speaker. Thom Green is the outreach manager for North Carolina's Hemlock Restoration Initiative. And after working for several years as an environmental educator in his native Oregon, Thom moved to North Carolina in 2014 to earn an MS in biology and with a focus in forest ecology from the Western Carolina University. Thom has been with HRI since 2017, managing HWA in North Carolina's remaining hemlock stands and educating landowners and the general public about what they can do for hemlocks. So Thom, I'm going to let you take over from here. And then while Thom is getting organized, one of the things he asked me to do is to run a little poll. So I'm going to go and do that now. So if you have a minute and would answer the poll questions, we just have 3 questions.
Thank you. Great. I was giving people a very long second to fill out that poll. Cool. Perfect. Well, it sounds like some people are pretty familiar with the issue and some folks are already taking some action. That's awesome. So yeah, so my name is Thom Green. And I want to thank Lisa and Maura for the invitation to speak with you all today and share a little bit about what we're doing in North Carolina. I won't reintroduce myself, but I do want to just mention the title of my talk because I kind of titled it with purpose. So the title is Hope for the Hemlocks. You can see this on the screen. HWA management approaches on public and private lands in North Carolina. And so while my goal today is to impress upon you the seriousness and importance of the issue of hemlock woolly adelgid, I also would like to leave you with a little bit of hope by the end that there are things that we can do to address the issue and save this pretty important species. So to frame the issue real quick, we're talking about hemlock trees, which are a foundation species in the ecosystems where they are present. And they're being affected by a non-native invasive pest called the hemlock woolly adelgid. Looks a little bit like that in the wintertime. And over time, the spread and infestation of HWA has led to massive hemlock mortality and become a major forest health issue throughout the East Coast. So I'm not going to go into a lot of background about this. I will be sharing, or more will be sharing, a couple videos that we created as part of our trainings for landowners, which do go into the background on both why hemlocks are so important and a little bit of the natural history, as well as the woolly adelgid itself, its biology, and how it affects the hemlock trees. But I'm kind of starting from the basic assumption that folks showed up today because they are concerned about the issue and realize that it needs some attention. So I want to try and devote our time this afternoon to focusing on what HRI has been doing in North Carolina and hopefully some things you can take away from our work. I will give just the most basic introduction, saying we're talking about Eastern and Carolina hemlocks in Eastern North America. Eastern hemlock has a huge range from the South in Alabama and Georgia all the way up into Canada, and then as far west over into Wisconsin and even a little bit in Minnesota. The Carolina hemlock is endemic to the Southern Appalachians, and both species are susceptible to hemlock woolly adelgid. So the hemlock woolly adelgid arrived in North Carolina sometime in the late 90s. And by about 2010, all the counties in North Carolina with some bit of hemlock had some presence detected of hemlock woolly adelgid. So it really just took about 10 years from the first infestation in the northernmost counties until HWA was impacting the whole range of hemlocks in the state in one level or another. So this led, as I mentioned, to some pretty serious mortality, especially of the largest and most beautiful trees, the most important to the ecosystem, and became a serious health issue for our forests in North Carolina. And so early on, The state agencies did what they could. Our state lands are managed by 3 different agencies. And in that time, those first early years, it was much more expensive. It was much more time consuming. And the methods that were used were much more labor intensive. And so early on, it was a challenge to get a large number of trees treated across the landscape. And just to give you a little number that I'll kind of come back to later, between about 2007, when the state lands started doing their hemlock treatment, until HRI really got into swing about 2015, about 10,000 trees, 10,000 hemlocks were treated on our state lands. And that doesn't account for what was happening in the national parks and the national forests. So it was becoming clear that this was going to be a huge issue in North Carolina, and it had already become a huge issue. And in 2013, a staffer for our Commissioner of Agriculture there on the screen, the staffer came out to Western North Carolina to visit some projects that were funded by some settlement funds from a lawsuit with the Tennessee Valley Authority. And one of those projects was focused on hemlocks and hemlock restoration. And so the staffer, when he saw that project, got really interested and excited and thought this would be something that the commissioner would care a lot about. And he was correct. So he went back to the commissioner, told him about what was going on and efforts that were underway. And the commissioner wanted to make hemlocks one of his signature projects. And so he approached a nonprofit in Western North Carolina called WNC Communities, who had actually been involved in helping distribute some of those TVA settlement funds already. And he wanted to put some money and some effort into the hemlock issue. And so in 2014, the Hemlock Restoration Initiative was established as a program to be administered by WNC Communities. And WNC Communities, just real briefly, was an ideal candidate to administer this program because they are connected to the rural communities across Western North Carolina, and especially the working on projects and initiatives that support the economic drivers of those communities. And so they have a history of successfully implementing and initiating and pushing through projects to support agriculture, farming, livestock, and forestry as well. And so HRI was really established as a collaborative partnership whose mission was to ensure that our native hemlocks, the Eastern Carolina hemlocks in North Carolina, could withstand hemlock woolly adelgid and survive to maturity through this collaboration between the government agencies, the state agencies, the local governments, the county governments, many NGOs and nonprofits, land trusts, and also the federal agencies like the Forest Service, and really with the goal of not just addressing the public lands, but also the private lands. And so HRI was set up to work on the management across all these boundaries and across all these groups and organizations, but also to do education for private landowners on what they could do to protect their trees. And so I won't talk much about the education piece today, but that is a small but very significant part of what we do, and it actually helps kind of ripple out into the community more than we could just working on our public lands. And so being a nonprofit, we are able to be flexible, and being focused on hemlocks allows us to be very efficient in what we do. We can help facilitate and increase the capacity of all of these different partners and organizations, and just be more efficient than if each of these entities were trying to do the work of protecting their hemlocks on their own. And so we're able to work with anybody and everybody who wants to care for their hemlocks. We're able to support them, and take action in all these different arenas. And so from the beginning, HRI has been involved with or supported all of the different, like I like as I like to say, tools in the toolbox for integrated pest management of Hemlock woolly adelgid. And so we directly work on implementing chemical control as a short-term measure to get out there and quickly try to preserve as many of the viable hemlock stands that we have left. We've also worked on being directly involved with biological control and supporting other efforts in biological control as a longer-term solution. And then we also support other partners who are working on things like genetic conservation of hemlock populations, research into silvicultural restoration techniques, and those who are trying to breed resistance into hemlocks for a resistance to HWA. And so really it's going to take, for there to be hope for the hemlocks, it's going to take using all of these different tools and strategies. So to talk a little bit about our model, I'm going to talk mostly about chemical treatment in the main chunk of this. So our model is to get out there and identify and establish what we call HCAs, or hemlock conservation areas. And we do this with the help of the agencies and partners we work with, being our eyes and ears on the ground, telling us where these significant areas are. And this is not a complete map of all the areas we work, but kind of shows you that we are spread out across the whole range throughout Western North Carolina, working on these state lands, working with partners on private conserved lands, and now also working to support the Forest Service in their retreatment efforts on the national forests in North Carolina. And so the way we approach this is what we call a strike team model. And this is actually something we did not come up with ourselves. We borrowed this from other agencies and other states as a way to get in with a small team in a focused way and quickly and efficiently carry out as much hemlock treatment as we can while we still have some remaining on the landscape, as I mentioned. And so what that allows us to do is incorporate and empower the agencies and partners that we work with. We're also able to work with volunteers and harness their effort as well. And so we can get out there with our trained staff of just a few people to lead groups of 5, 10, 15, sometimes even larger, and really carry out some great treatment, and sometimes treating, hundreds or even 1,000 trees in a day. So our main tool is systemic treatments with 2 different chemicals. Some of you may be familiar with these names: imidacloprid and dinotephurin. And so our treatments typically are done to the soil. And so our primary tool being a soil drench. Soil injection needs some equipment. Soil drench is great because it's very low tech. We can travel light. And the way we do this is with a very low volume mix. And I'll talk a little bit about our dosing as well. But we're able to get out there and treat those hundreds of trees in a day with these methods. We also utilize bark spray as a way to avoid soil treatments in particularly environmental sensitive situations. We don't use stem injection currently in our work, but we do use bark spray as sort of a lower tech way to avoid soil treatments. And so some updates about this. One thing that people may not know now is that hemlock treatment is much less expensive than it used to be. And so we have generic imidacloprid products that you can treat a hemlock tree for, we usually talk in inches of diameter. So you can treat a hemlock tree for around 5 to 10 cents an inch. And so you can treat a foot diameter tree for $1 or $2. And this is much different than it was 10 or 15 years ago. There's also research, some of which done in the Smokies down here in North Carolina and Tennessee, that shows that the longevity of imidacloprid is much longer than it was thought to be before. So now we know that the chemical will protect the tree, be actually active in the tree for anywhere from 5 to 7 years. And then you have to account for that time for reinfestation. So that can really extend your treatment intervals if you're trying to do ongoing treatment of trees to keep them protected to anywhere from 5 to 10 years. And we go back to those trees, those initial trees that were treated on state lands, 8+ years ago. And even as they're getting reinfested, we can definitely tell a difference in the health of those trees over that longer period. There are also new products. One is called Cortect, which is a tablet form of imidacloprid. And this is a great tool because it is even lighter weight than our low volume soil drench equipment. We can take thousands of these tablets up to Rocky Ridge and treat hundreds of Carolina hemlocks in a day, where we would either have to carry in all the water, up on those dry ridges. We don't have access to streams we can mix in. So it really is a great, useful tool. And it also makes it very quick and efficient to treat small trees very quickly. It just takes 1 or 2 tablets for a small diameter tree or seedling. The other great tool that we have available to us now, based on some research, is what we call the optimized dosing guidelines. And so I think this will be particularly interesting to this audience. So this is based on research by Elizabeth McCarty, formerly Benton, and colleagues. And so this is, they did the math, they did the research and the chemical analysis to determine for imidacloprid in particular, what dose of active ingredient is needed to keep a hemlock protected over that lifespan of the chemical. And so this does a few things. It's tailored specifically to hemlocks. And so these pesticide labels are very general and broad for lots of different pests and lots of different tree species and plant species. And so this is tailored specifically to hemlocks based on the diameter, breast height, the DBH. It allows us to be much more efficient with our chemical, which means that we can treat more trees per acre and stay within those acre limits. It's going to cost us less money in terms of chemical, even though imidacloprid is cheaper. And so it just overall is great research to know about for you all as you're doing your treatment on your hemlock trees. And we have particular instructions on our website, on our treatment for landowners page, that talks about this optimized dosing. And there's also a great white paper by Elizabeth McCarty that goes into, and colleagues that goes into different methods besides soil drench, in particular, if you use soil injectors, on how you can mix and dose for this optimized dosing. And the main impact on here, as you can kind of see in this graph, is really those larger trees, and even the smaller trees too, we're able to put out much less chemical than we would have in the past based on the label. So it's a great, great tool. There's also some really good research on the neonicotinoids, so imidacloprid in particular, and how they impact the ecosystem. And so when we're talking about off-target impacts, right, it's really about not just the hazard of the pesticide, but also the amount of exposure. That's going to make up your risk, right? So if you have something that's a large hazard, you have a large exposure, there's a huge risk there. Something that's a small hazard, but you get a large exposure, you can still have a significant risk. Something that's a very small hazard with limited exposure, very minimal risk. So what does this mean for hemlocks and pollinators, right? Well, how we use and apply the chemical are really the key. We do these targeted treatments right at the base of the tree, within a foot or two of the trunk of the root flare. It also helps a lot that hemlocks are wind pollinated, and they also don't produce as much resin as some other conifers do, so they're not visited by as many insects. So overall, we expect pretty low risk if we can reduce that exposure. So neonicotinoids are great at killing invertebrates. That's why they're such great insecticides for hemlock woolly adelgid. If we can limit that exposure, that will cut down our risk. And I mentioned, and I don't expect you to read all those titles of those papers, but I mentioned there is good research now on those impacts to the soil arthropod communities, the canopy arthropod communities, and also impacts on water quality. And so overall, we use that research to kind of guide our best management practices, one of which being in regards to water quality. We use a 10-foot setback from water, and that was something that was researched and evaluated mostly, I think, in the Smokies again, but they evaluated the watersheds that had been treated with that setback and watersheds that had had hemlocks and hemlock decline that had not been treated, and found with that setback that there wasn't a measurable difference in the water quality in the stream invertebrates. And so we feel good about that as a best management practice for limiting our impact on water quality. And that's where we bring in that tool of a basal bark spray, or you could use a stim injection. And then over the longer term of these, longer treatment intervals of 5 or more years, the overall impact on those other communities in the soil or in the tree crown, they recover. So the long-term impacts on those are negligible because there is that time for those communities to recover. So we're not talking about a no risk option here, but it is a fairly low risk. And as you all know, who are land managers, every management decision, involves those trade-offs. And so it's up to you to evaluate the costs versus the benefits of doing treatment or losing hemlocks. And then whatever we decide to do, we want to minimize those risks. Before I jump into some other things, I do want to mention a couple things about the other chemicals we use. So I mentioned the Cortec as a great tool. I also wanted to mention dinotefuran. Some people might be familiar with the brand name Safari. There's some other brands out there. Both Cortec and dinotefuran are still under patent. They don't have generics like imidacloprid does, so they are more expensive. Dinotefuran in particular, though, is a great tool we can use as a soil drench or as a bark spray. And the main way we use that, or the main difference between that and imidacloprid, is the speed with which it works. And so the way we use that is trees that have declined pretty far, into advanced decline, maybe much larger trees, or trees that are very heavily infested. Those are ones we're going to target with dinotefuran. And I don't want to call it a miracle worker, but it's a little bit of a miracle worker sometimes. And trees that you would think would have no way of recovering with a combined treatment of dinotefuran for that short-term punch and the longer-term, longer lasting imidacloprid can really help a tree recover in a way that might amaze folks. So I do want to mention biological control. It is not our main tool, but it is one of those longer-term strategies that we have done a significant amount of work with here in North Carolina, and that we are supporting through a few different ways. So mostly through the release of Laricobius beetles. There's 2 Laricobius species that we work with as an introduced biological control. We also do monitoring in those release sites and far away from those release sites, as well as some capture and relocation, or also collecting to help support some of the labs that are doing the research and rearing of those beetles. And so you can see some pictures there of us monitoring with volunteers, with college groups actually as well in the lower left of that 4-panel there. And we just go out when we monitor and use a beat sheet method and see what's going to fall down. That's a great way to monitor for Laricobius beetles. I won't go into the couple other species on that picture there, but Sassy or Sasagia skimnasuge, or ST, some might know it as, is another biocontrol that was introduced before the Laricobius nigrinus beetle. And then kind of the new kid on the block, the new horizon for biocontrol, is a silver fly called Leucotoraxis. There's a couple different species. And so what I like to say for biocontrol is that while it is a longer term goal, right now it's not a standalone reliable tool that we can put all of our eggs into that basket. And biocontrol can really be how you approach biocontrol, and especially integrating it with chemical control, can be very location dependent. And so our situation here in North Carolina involves a couple factors, one of which being that before biocontrol really got going here, we did have some pretty advanced decline of our hemlocks and lost a number of stands or had stands really decimated. The other piece of it, though, is that North Carolina, Western North Carolina, has been kind of a hot spot, especially for Laricobius nigrinus. And so we can now find Laricobius nigrinus and sometimes Laricobius osakensis far away from release sites. Sometimes, almost anywhere we go, we'll break out the beat sheet and look around and can find one or two beetles. So we know that they're establishing well. They're persisting. They have a 1-year generation, so they're persisting year to year, and they're spreading on their own. So the real question remains is what impact are they having on the tree health? And there is actually some ongoing research being done, particularly at Virginia Tech, looking at, not just how are the beetles feeding or are they present, but are they having an impact on the actual tree health? There is some anecdotal evidence that once a tree does recover from woolly adelgid, has chemical treatment and does recover, that the presence of the biocontrols may help that tree hang on longer, but it's not clear whether the beetles are going to completely save the trees by themselves. And so we do have to look into those questions. Our overall objective is to integrate these two. And so one resource I want to point you to that we do have a link to on our website, you can also look up, is a manager's guide for integrating chemical and biological control for hemlock woolly adelgid. And this is especially good in areas where there have not yet been a lot of establishment and releases of the predator beetles. But you can also, if there are predator beetles present already, you can use these techniques to integrate that. And there's a bunch of great information in that manager's guide, also about things like assessing hemlock health and lots of stuff like that, and information about particulars of chemical treatment and different ways to approach chemical treatment. So overall, for biocontrol, there's not going to be one single species that's going to save the trees. It's really going to take, over a long period of time, the establishment of a suite of predators, a whole community, what you would see where hemlock woolly adelgid is native, like in Western North America or in Asia. And so that's kind of the longer term goal, is keep the trees alive now so that we can develop this predator community and these other restoration strategies, like the silvicultural work or breeding a resistant tree, to be able to put all those things together long term. I do want to talk a little bit about ways we are trying to evaluate our work and measure our success. And one that I want to mention in particular that may be a useful tool for you all is what we call an impact plot or a monitoring plot. And so this is based on a model that the National Park Service and the North Carolina National Forests use, where we identify a few particular trees that we're going to return to over certain intervals to the same trees and take repeated measures of their health. So looking at things like crown health, growth from new shoots, presence of adelgid, things like that. And so ideally, these are established either at or shortly after the time of initial treatment. And then you can return to those on whatever interval makes the most sense for your management. Really, something on the order of 3 or more years is probably going to be the most fruitful. Going year after year to the same trees, might not yield the results you're looking for in terms of, time effectiveness and labor efficiency. But over a longer period of time, returning to these trees, the idea is that we can see whether the treatment's having an effect, whether the crown foliar density is increasing, or whether the health of the tree is continuing to decline. We're also trying to incorporate untreated trees into these impact plots. So not just picking 10 treated trees, but maybe a couple of which don't receive treatment, things of varying sizes. And so we can get, it's not a systematic research plot, but it is kind of a sample of what's going on and what might be there. The other thing we can point to as a great sign of success simply is just the number of those hemlock conservation areas we've been able to expand or establish over the last several years, and just the exponential increase of the number of trees that have been treated on North Carolina's state lands and private conserved lands since HRI was established. And this is not just our work. This is our collaboration with partners. But I mentioned before that in that first few years of treatment from about 2007 through 2015, only about 10,000 trees were treated on North Carolina state lands. And so in the years since HRI got up and running and started working with our strike team and with different state agencies, particularly the North Carolina Forest Service, we've been able to either directly treat or support the treatment of over 10,000 or over 100,000 trees now. And I know that number is climbing every season. So that's really great. That's great news that we've been able to help facilitate and directly carry out that just huge increase in getting that initial treatment or retreating those earlier treated trees. I want to wrap it up pretty soon, but I do want to highlight some of our, kind of case study examples of our partnerships and success. So the first one I want to point to is really one of our key main partners is the North Carolina Forest Service, particularly the Forest Health Branch of the Forest Service, and also a program called Bridge. So Bridge is a program for young incarcerated males to learn particularly firefighting skills, but also other natural resource management skills. And these gentlemen work hard. If you're familiar with the Southern Appalachians and where hemlocks grow down here, it's steep slopes, it's rough terrain. And so our work with Bridge Crews are those days where we can go out with half a dozen or a dozen of these men and, in our crew as well, and treat 1,000 trees. And it's really kind of amazing. And I want to point to a particular success of Bridge and the North Carolina Forest Service Forest Health Branch on a particular state forest in North Carolina, the Rendezvous State Forest. Over the course of a little more than a year, I think they were able to treat 45,000 trees on this single state forest through the work of Bridge Crews and the North Carolina Forest Service staff. And so that's a big chunk of that 100,000 that I mentioned. So that's been a huge partnership for us. And early on, before we had more volunteer crews or even our bigger hired crew that we have these days, Bridge was the main way we got a lot of our work done. I also want to mention just one example of a state park we work with. We worked with a number of state parks, but I like to point to Hanging Rock State Park as kind of the poster child for our partnerships with the state parks. And so things that I like to talk about with Hanging Rock is, first of all, the investment on the part of the park staff and the park rangers in the protection of their hemlocks. They were very proactive about getting us involved. We got out there with Bridge Crews and were able to protect one of the easternmost populations of Carolina hemlocks. That on the left there is my favorite natural bonsai Carolina hemlock tree. And so one area in particular, this wonderful trail going up to this beautiful viewpoint called Moore's Knob, the trail's just aligned with Carolina hemlock trees. And so by getting in there with the park staff, with Bridge, the park brought in volunteers and interns. We were able to get hundreds of trees treated just going up to this beautiful viewpoint, as well as trees around other parts of the park. Another partnership that I love to talk about is what we call our Paddlers Hemlock Health Action Task Force, or FAT for short, FAT with 2 H's. So this is a partnership between the Wildlife Resource Commission, a local nonprofit environmental group called Mountain True, in particular, the river keeper for the Green River, and a paddling advocacy group called American Whitewater. And so this is happening, it has been happening on the Green River game land near Saluda, North Carolina, not too far from the North Carolina, South Carolina border. And so just to give you the short version of this, these paddlers, these expert whitewater paddlers, go down into the Green River Gorge where there's class 3, class 4, sometimes in areas where there's class 5 rapids. And we've developed very special protocols for how we can get the Cortec tablets, in particular is what we use, get the Cortec tablets in there in a safe way. And the paddlers, they go down the river and they find a good place to pull off where they see some hemlocks up the slope, and they scramble up these steep slopes and really are able to target those trees that would be very difficult for us to get to by land, and are also ecologically some of the most significant trees, these large trees on the river gorge that are having that outsized impact on the river's health. So this has been a huge success, and we're hoping that this will be, the Green River Pot project will be a pilot that can be expanded into other states and other rivers as a way to utilize these awesome volunteers who have these skills to be able to get into these areas that would otherwise probably go untreated. And the last example I want to mention is one of our projects, one of our partnerships with a private community. And so we have worked with a few private communities on what we call a cost work share program. And so Connestee Falls is kind of the perfect example of how this kind of project can go. One of the board members for the HWA, and this is near Brevard, North Carolina, if you're familiar with that area. One of the board members of the HOA reached out to us wanting to incorporate into their kind of natural resource protection initiative something with the Hemlocks. And they have, I think, over 3,000 acres. About 1,800 of that is common forested area, about 18 miles of trails through those forests, many of which have hemlocks along the trails or along those streams. These are the headwater streams where hemlocks have just an outsized impact on the ecosystem. And so, so that board member was interested and got us connected with some of the residents. And one resident in particular came to one of our volunteer days and also came to one of our trainings for landowners and professionals that we do as part of our outreach and education. And she really became the spearhead for going back to the community, rounding up a group of about a dozen volunteers. They went out on the trails, did an inventory of their trees, and then we came together with them for a couple work days last April of 2021 with our staff and their volunteers, and we're able to treat about 400 trees in 2 days. And then they helped carry that forward. So that was really the jumpstart for them carrying that forward. And in the fall, they treated, last fall, they treated on their own almost about 600 more trees. I don't know what they've been doing this spring, but I'm sure they're going even deeper into the woods and getting more of those trails. So I'm really excited to hear about what they're doing. But this is just the kind of ripple effect that we can have by being able to work across these boundaries, by being able to work with lots of different partners and also do that outreach and education. And so this is a model that we're trying to work with other communities that have significant hemlock resources on their common property. So I want to wrap it up so we have some time for questions, but I like to end with this message. So in North Carolina, or maybe in your area, we've seen lots of areas like this where hemlock woolly adelgid has just started to wipe out the hemlock trees, especially the largest, most beautiful, most ecologically significant trees. But we do know that out there on the landscape, there are plenty of areas, and also the areas where hemlock woolly adelgid hasn't yet spread to, that do need our attention and our protection, so that these little ones coming up in the understory will have a forest to grow into. So thanks so much for your time. I'm happy to answer questions now. And if you want to write down my, my contact information, and I think that's also going to get sent out in an email as well. I'm happy to follow up with folks if we don't get to your questions this afternoon.
We do have several questions, Thom. Thank you so much for your presentation today. And I can see that Margot is jumping in a little bit as well, talking about one of the questions was how your crews were funded. So she addressed that for us. So we have one question. Have you witnessed any trees with significant resistance or positive responses against the invasive? And to go along with that question, what it means is a response by the tree before you even treat the chemicals.
Yeah, that's a great question. So in our eastern species, in Eastern North America, the Carolina and Eastern hemlocks don't appear to have any strong innate resistance. They're basically all susceptible, and unlike some of the trees out in Asia or maybe even in the Pacific Northwest, they don't seem to have any inherent resistance. However, there are initiatives out there. There's one based in North Carolina There was also some work being done at the University of Rhode Island, and there's a new initiative through the Holden Arboretum near Lake Erie to look for what we call those survivor or lingering hemlocks. And there's actually an app. I didn't throw this in the presentation, but there's an app called Tree Snap where you can report these hemlocks that are in areas where they've been hit by woolly adelgid and lots of the trees have died, but there may be a few that are doing a lot better than their surrounding brethren and hanging on. And so there is research into looking for that native resistance. And there's also research into doing hybridization between our native species and Asian species. So all of that is to say, it is not, we have not seen evidence that several trees or a stand of trees is displaying much resistance to the bug without some kind of intervention.
Okay. Any anti-cancer drugs in these hemlocks?
I haven't heard anything about that, although there is a shelf fungus called, gosh, it's escaping my brain, reishi, the reishi mushroom that lives on dying and dead hemlock trees that has been looked at in both, like in Chinese medicine and also other forms of naturopathic medicine as a medicinal, and some people say it has various properties. I'm not going to endorse any of those properties, but there is some interesting, information out there about reishi mushrooms. Problem is, if we lose all the hemlock trees, we're going to lose all the reishi mushrooms too.
So everything's connected.
Yeah, definitely.
So a couple of people actually commented on your use of volunteers, and I know Margot, who is the executive director of the Hemlock Restoration Initiative, is jumping in and answering some of those questions. But somebody commented that's really interesting that you use the paddlers and so many volunteers who can treat using pesticides. Is the state, just North Carolina states, allow for that? They were saying that they're not sure how many other states allow for non-licensed folks.
Yeah, so that's a good point. And I realized when I got to the end of the presentation, I thought I had a slide in there kind of bringing it back to you all. But I want to just emphasize the message that this is our model and this is what's worked for us. And so, take what you think might work for you and leave the rest. And also look into your local laws. There's a lot more restriction on neonicotinoids now in various states. And also working with volunteers is a very tricky thing. It might work for some programs, it might not work for others. It's something we've had to kind of learn along the way. And so that's just kind of that general message of, take what you hear today in what might work in your locality. Also reach out to the local HWA partners and initiatives in your area, whether that's the state agencies or universities, or the larger U.S. Forest Service HWA initiative that we participate in and learn a lot from. So back to volunteers, because our staff are all certified pesticide applicators, we can supervise volunteers to do that treatment. And landowners in North Carolina, if they're treating their own hemlocks or treating a neighbor's hemlock, not for compensation, don't need a pesticide license to be able to use the generic imidacloprid or the dinotefuran on their own trees. And so we're fortunate that our situation here allows us that flexibility with the imidacloprid to be able to do those treatments and to train landowners how to do it themselves without necessarily needing to hire somebody.
Okay. Another question, can you walk us through your process protecting a typical hemlock stand? After you have applied chemical control, how do you know you have been successful or need to follow up with more or other methods? And how to ensure that WAB doesn't spread to other uninfected trees? Lots of questions there.
Yeah, that's, I'll try to do it quickly. So our process kind of runs through, we go out, we hear about a site or we know about a site. We do on the ground scouting, deciding, where we're going to focus our efforts on that particular property. We write up a treatment plan that is then a living document that can be passed on, either given back to the managing agency or used if we come around for the retreatment. So we write up that document. We go out, we do the treatment with our crew and with our partners. And then, we kind of write a follow-up to that treatment, include that in the hemlock treatment plan. And then, as I mentioned, we're starting to install these impact plots. And so that's where we pick a small subset, usually about 10 trees, to act as, kind of a, very imperfect barometer. So looking to see what is going to be the impact if we come back 3, 4, 5 years after that first treatment, and see what's going on, because we can't remember, dozens or more of different hemlock conservation areas that we go to. And so that's a tool that we're using more and more, along with those hemlock treatment plans and those initial scouting assessments, to be able to go back and look at the sites. And we're actually coming up to starting some of those retreatments of those first treatments we did in 2016 and 2017. And we're seeing some great responses in these areas where we treated acres and acres of trees that are taken to the chemical very well. There's lots of new growth. Crowns are much denser than they were when we did the treatment. So that's kind of the process. I hope that was what the person was looking for who asked that.
Okay. And then how do you prioritize when you have a conservation area? How are you prioritizing the trees that get treatment, or is it just all trees?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So we have a few benchmarks that we use. So we're working with systemic chemicals, which means the tree is going to have to take that up from their roots, or if we put it into the bark, take it up through that tree's vascular tissue. And so we have a few benchmarks. And so to get into kind of the weeds on it, with imidacloprid, it's a larger molecule, moves slower through the tree. It can take sometimes up to a year to get into the tree, if it's particularly large, before it'll start killing the adelgid. Dinotefuran, on the other hand, can move into the tree within weeks or a month or so, even large trees, and start killing the adelgid. Dinotefuran also just moves through the tissue easier. It's a smaller molecule, more water soluble. And so some of our benchmarks are, we look at the crown health. So how much of the crown is still alive on like kind of a vertical scale. So we call that the live crown ratio. And some of this is on our website as well. And we look at the density of the foliage. And so if the tree has about more than half of that live crown still intact, because hemlocks can have branches, all the way touching the ground. So if more than half of that tree height is still alive, even if it's just a few sprigs on the branch tips, and the density of the foliage is kind of in the moderate range, we're pretty comfortable just using imidacloprid in those cases and seeing the tree come back. You can treat trees with just imidacloprid kind of below those thresholds, but the chances of success start to decline. And then when we're out in the woods and we're trying to make quick decisions, anything so below that 50% or with a thinner crown or a heavy infestation, we'll add the dinotefuran. And because we don't want to come back, the next year after the dinotefuran wears off, we'll treat with imidacloprid at the same time. You could make the decision to treat with dinotefuran. It'll wear off within a year or two, and then go back and treat with imidacloprid if that's a feasible thing. And then below about 30% live crown, or if the tree is just so threadbare, it barely has any needles left, then we'll skip that tree. So really we're looking at, will the needles be able to pull through transpiration, be able to pull that chemical up into the tree?
Okay.
Well, I can talk about that stuff for hours, sorry.
Well, thank you so much for just this presentation today. It was fascinating, and the amount of trees that you've been able to save is really quite impressive. I just want to tell everyone who joined us today that all of the links Thom provided have been posted in chat. They will also be sent to you in an email following this recording, probably within 24 hours. Look for it sometime tomorrow. That will have the recorded presentation as well as all the links as well. So thank you, Thom. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you so much.
And we look forward to seeing you again at another webinar for NAA. Thank you very much, everybody.